Welcome back to Forsyth Virtual Academy's United States History course. In this part of the unit, we're going to talk about the Great Depression. We're going to learn more about what caused it, as well as the impact that the Dust Bowl had on migration of people and continuation of the Depression, as well as unemployment and the creation of what was called Hoovervilles. As we go through and learn about the Great Depression in this unit, it's important to remember that you can't really pinpoint one thing that led to the Great Depression. In reality, it's more of a culmination of things. And the first one we're going to talk about is the stock market crash of 1929. While some Americans were roaring with the 20s, almost 75% of Americans lived at or near the poverty level. Many Americans overextended their credit with the purchase of things like cars and farms, homes and stocks. More and more goods were being produced, which resulted in a surplus, and many investors were purchasing stock on margin. Buying stock on margin means that you only pay for a portion of the stock up front. So let's say it's worth $10. You only pay $1 to buy it. That sounds awesome when the stock market's doing great. Not so awesome when the stock market's doing bad. So they pay that fraction of a cost up front to buy the stock and then promise to pay the full amount once they sell the stock later. Let's keep going here because we're going to find out that turned out really bad. All right, let's step out of this unit for a moment, which by the way, it's pretty cool that Apple Clips can make it look like I'm colored into a place. Pretty awesome. Well, I started to listen to some of the recording and noticed it sounds like I'm talking in a paper bag. So this whole thing that I bought thinking it was awesome at Christmas time, all about the little people, well, it's pretty awful. It doesn't work very well. So back to the old way. So stocks were being purchased on margin, but that wasn't the only thing that helped cause the stock market crash in 1929. Economists recognized that there was a problem. Farm incomes were down. Important industries like lumber and mining, the railroads, and the auto industry were showing a decline in profits. However, these factors, plus the stock market prices that began to fall in October of 1929, were thought of as temporary. But towards the end of October, panic struck when investors began trading millions of shares, causing prices to plunge for 3 straight days. On October 24th, known as Black Thursday, investors traded over 13 million shares of stock. Then, on October 29th, known as Black Tuesday, more than 16 million other shares traded hands. As prices plummeted, people that had purchased their stock on margin had no way to pay their original worth. By 1932, over 12 million people were unemployed. Of those who still had jobs, many worked reduced hours for a reduced wage. Throughout the decade, unemployment averaged about 18%. However, it hit a peak in 1933 when 25% of Americans were without a job. The Great Depression impacted more than half of all Americans. Many people lived on the street, abandoned cars, or even cardboard boxes. Children quit school, and many suffered from malnutrition and disease. And the U.S. banking system was nearly destroyed when people realized that banks were in crisis and rushed to withdraw their funds. 2/5 of the nation's banks failed between 1929 and 1933. At the start of the Great Depression, the president was Herbert Hoover, and he did not respond well to the economy or unemployment in America. Hoover was criticized for leaving too much of the responsibility for fixing the problems in the hands of the states. The states simply lacked the funds to make much difference in the economy. In some areas of the country, up to 50% of people were unemployed. With no money, People couldn't afford housing and ended up living in shanty towns. These were places where hundreds of people lived in tents and shacks. Many Americans blamed President Hoover for these conditions, and the shanty towns quickly became called Hoovervilles. Farmers were also in trouble. A lot were unable to make payments that were coming due on their buildings and equipment, thus defaulting on their loans and losing their land and becoming homeless. 3/4 of all rural banks closed between 1920 and 1932, making the farmers' problems even worse. As farmers tried to compensate, they overproduced, causing the price of crops to fall. To offset their losses, they planted even more. Overplanting caused the soil to erode and blow away. Several years of drought and overfarming caused huge dust storms to form and travel across the Great Plains. These dust storms covered fields and partially buried buildings. This was termed the Dust Bowl and devastated the prairie region with drought and poverty in the early 1930s. To escape the Dust Bowl and find work, many people from the Great Plains region began moving to California. People from the Great Plains weren't the only ones migrating in search of work. People from the South traveled north to look for factory jobs. Many of them moved to Detroit to work in car factories. This migration of people changed American society from a heavily rural society to a more urban one. The Great Depression impacted every region of the country and raged on with no end in sight. However, in 1932, a new man challenged President Hoover for the presidency. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he blamed Hoover and the Republicans for causing the Great Depression. In the end, Roosevelt won by almost 20% of the popular vote and 472 electoral votes over Hoover's 59. It was a resounding victory for FDR, but now he had to figure out how to get Americans back to work.